We are going to study this book, The Art of Courtly Love, Andreas Capellanus. Okay, so let's start. Preface, I think it's important to read out, otherwise we would be missing many significant points related to this. So how this is going on, let me just see. Okay, this is what I think it's good enough. We can read out. Okay. Right, preface. This translation was originally undertaken some 15 years ago for the use of students in a course in medieval literature in translation. It is now published in the hope that it may prove useful to others who desire some acquaintance with one of the significant books of Middle Ages, but who are unable to read the medieval Latin in which it is written. My primary aim has been to preserve this idea of Andreas and to keep close to what he says, even though it has been necessary at times to use somewhat awkward English in doing so. My secondary aim has been to produce something for his style. This is in general colloquial, but it is colored with biblical expression, and at times it becomes almost pompous when we tries to reproduce the speech of the upper classes. In other words, in one respect, however, it seems best not to follow him. Andreas is very fond of loose, strangling sentence strung together with and, but, for, so, or some similar connectives. Medieval rhetoric was much more tolerant of some sentence than modern readers are. But Andreas seems to go beyond the practice of his contemporaries. In my translation, such sentences have been broken up into shorter, more manageable units. The basis of the translation is to Rozel's edition of text, pages, reprint, inconvenient to use, but it has no independent authority. For the biblical questions, I have followed the Doye Reims translation, since this represents most closely the version that was in use the time of Andreas. Sometimes the Vulgate reference different material from those of the King James Version. In such case, I have added in parenthesis reference to the letter text. The translation from classical and medieval authors are mostly my own, although I have checked them by other translations when these are accessible. Such parallel passages are cited to throw light upon the text of Andreas, but without any attempt to assert that he made use of them. An intensive investigation of his source was no part of my plan. For several of these references and for other assistance of encouragement, I am indebted to Professor Afrad Steiner of Hunter College. Professor Roger S. Loomis of Columbia has made a number of valuable suggestions, and I believe the book is better because of them. Greatest of all is my debt to editor of the series, Professor Austin P. Evans. He has read the whole work carefully and manuscript and again in proof, and this vigilance has saved me from the number of errors. His knowledge and judgment have helped me over many difficult places. JJP. Now let's come to the content. Editor's instruction, then author's preface, book 1, introduction to the treatise of love. What is love? Between what persons love may exist? Where love gets its name? What the effect of love is? What persons are fit for love? In what manner love may be acquired and in how many ways? First dialogue, a man of the middle class speaks with a woman of the same class. Second dialogue, a man of the middle class speaks with a woman of the nobility. Third dialogue, a man of the middle class speaks with a woman of the higher nobility. Fourth dialogue, a nobleman speaks with a woman of the middle class. Fifth, a nobleman speaks with a woman. Then content is sixth dialogue, a man of the higher nobility speaks with a woman of the middle class. Seventh dialogue, a man of the high nobility speaks with a woman of the simple nobility. Eighth dialogue, a man of the higher nobility speaks with a woman of the same class. So if you see the content, in this content, it is very clear that there are a mannerism in which if a man of a middle class is speaking to a woman of a middle class or same class, what could be the manner of speaking? And then there is a change. If a man of middle class speaks with a woman of a nobility, then the tone, pattern, and style and collection of the words would be different. Third is The man of the middle class speaks with a woman of the high nobility, and a woman nobleman speaks with a woman of the middle class. So there is at the moment the class hierarchy or the status of the woman is changing, and how the dialogues and the patterns are also changing. So these are the things, minor things we will get into this. And then next is the love of the clergy, the love of nuns, the love got with money, the easy attainment of one's object, the love of peasants, the love of prostitute. So this all is a different love, various decision and love cases, rules of love. So if a clergyman is loving, if a nun is loving, if a love that is with the money, you can buy a love with the money, or easy attainment of one's object. And if a love of a peasant, how a peasant would be loving, and the pattern of the love of a prostitute will be different from a nuns and a clergy man. So these are the different forms of love. Then book 2 is how love may be retained, how love when it has been acquired may be kept, how a love one consummated may it be increased, in what ways love may be decreased, how love may come to an end, indications that one's love is returned if one of the lover is unfaithful to the other. So these are all dynamics of love. If you have got love, if your love is consummated, how you will continue. If you need to acquire a love, what are the rules through which you can acquire a love. If your love is decreasing, then what are the strategies need to be followed. And then end of the love. And if love is returned, you loved somebody and then you get in return a faithful and unfaithful love. So these are all the categories we are going to study. And I think this book is going to be very, very interesting. So let's start introduction. Of the treatise on loves, Andreas as Andreas Capellanus, a recent French scholar, has written, it is like Bernito Latini's Tresors or the Speculum Majus of Vincent of Beauvais, one of those capital works which reflect the thought of the great epoch, which explain the secret of civilization. It is from this point of view that translation of the work is here presented. Andreas is not a great literary figure like his friends and fellow citizens Chaitin de Troyes, but perhaps for that very reason he brings us closer to the actual life of the time that does Chaitin. From his work, we get a vivid picture of life in a medieval court like that of Troyes or Poitiers. To the students of medieval manners, such as pictures is especially valuable because in these courts was taught and probably also practiced that single social system to which Gaston Paris has given the name of courtly love. So Gaston Paris, if you remember in earlier article, I have already discussed about this. Gaston Paris is first giving the name courtly love. Remember, Gaston Paris is giving the first name courtly love. So courtly love is first time used by Gaston Paris, Gaston Paris. This developed in the 12th century among the troubadours of southern France, but soon spread in the neighboring countries and, in one way or another, colored the literature of the most Western Europe or centuries. Its influence did not cease with Renaissance and even today. So these are the references which are mostly in Latin and French. I don't know that. So I'm just reading English again. Although it would scarcely be correct to speak of courtly love in our present-day society, but some phrases of still linger on in our modern attitude towards romance. For all practical purpose, we may say that the origin of the courtly love is to be found in the writings of the poet Ovid, who lived in Rome in the time of Emperor Augustus. Among his poems, The Art of Love, Ars Amatoria, the Cure of Love, Remedies Amores, and Amorous, all dealings, as the name implies, with the subject of love. The Art of Love was sort of parody on the technical treatise of Ovid, say, a bit of the fool in which should never have been taken serious, but often was. The Amorous supplement this with the account of some of the Ovid's own experience in the art. The Cure of Love shows those who are anxious to terminate a love affair how they may do so. Ovid does not represent his idea as a formal system, although he does not speak of a system, but from his writing men in later times derived materials to make system. Love is Ovid, convenience is frankly sensual. Merry sensuality, Lewis calls it. And there is little or no trace of his work of the romantic affection of the later times. It is extramarital and does not contemplate matrimony as its object. Ovid is careful to say that the love he has in his mind, not that of the maidens and married women, but only such a modesty and the law permits. Much ingenuity has been expended in the showing that his doctrine is really not very immoral according to our present standard. But in the Middle Ages, it was assumed as a matter of course, and the were who must be deluded, and whom Ovid delighted to delude, was the woman's husband, and his statement and husband and wives cannot love each other, and that even Penelope may be seduced if one is persistent, and his approving account of how Venus and Helen receives his husband helped to confirm the impression. Whatever may have been Ovid's real imagining and sincerity on this point is not beyond question. The man of Middle Ages, through that they had his approval of the dictum, and the best partner in the love affair is another man's wife. Ovid does not restrict either man or woman to one affair at a time, but it does point out that the matter is greatly complicated if one's woman learnt of how love affairs with another. Troubles arises too if the lady's husband learn that she is in love with another man. So there is good reason of keeping such an affair secret. Moreover, the very fact that it is secret makes it's much more pleasant. Other ideas of Ovid with influenced the conception of the courtly love. Love is a kind of warfare, and every lover is a soldier. Cupid is a generalissimo, and under him are the women whose were power the man is absolute. A man should deceive a woman if he can, but he must never appear to oppose her slightest wish. To please her, he must watch all night before her doors, undo all sorts of hardship, perform all sorts of absurd action, and for love of her he must become pale and thin and sleepless. No matter what he may do, or from what motives, he must persuade her that it is all done for her sake. If, in spite of all these demonstrations of the affections, he still remains obdurate, he must arouse her jealousy, he must pretend to be in love with someone else, and when the first one kind she has lost him, she will probably capitulate, and he can clasp her sobbing to his breast. Of the circulation of Ovid's poem in the early Middle Ages, we know comparatively little, but in the 12th and 13th centuries, so popular was his book, and Ludwig Trub used to call his period Ovidians, as the two preceding period were these are all Latin. In this revival of art of love and its full part, it circulated both in the Latin and in the vernacular, and was written to adapt it to the changed condition of medieval society. Much of the literature of France and England was colored by its ideas, although a certain amount of the sensuality was glossed over. Even if its courtly love has never been developed, Ovid's influence would have been profound among the troubadours of southern France. However, this influence took on a special character. Special character. Much of the literature of the France and England was colored by its ideas, although a certain amount of sensuality was glossed over. Even if the love had never developed, of its influence or has been profound among the troubadours of the southern. The material was combined with the other element, and the whole combination was infused with a new spirit. It is to this new combination, as it developed in the south and it spread to other land, that we refer when we speak of courtly love. No one of the uh, troubadours produced even an approach to the treatise on the art. We have to get our ideas of it from their lyric poem. Yet, in spite of individual differences and of the changes that took place with time, we can get a fairly coherent picture of the system. The basis of it's in the familiar material. Love is an art and has its rules. Lovers take service in the army of Cupid, and in the service they become pale and thin and sleepless. One cannot love one's own wife, but must love the wife of some other man. So, or if necessity, the affair must be kept secret. Love secret. Love can't exist apart from the jealousy. But but the spirit that but the spirit that connects these ideas is wholly different from that of the Ovid. The lover and his lady are no longer playing a game of mutual deceit. She is now his feudal suzerain, and he owes allegiance to her, and to Cupid to her. Her status is far above, and although in the theory he holds to the percept of Ovid that love levels all ranks, in practice he seldom dares to presume upon his equality, and his addressed to the lady are full of deepest humility. This difference in tone is not unnatural, results of the great social differences between Rome in Ovid's day and French in the 12th century. The source of the other modification of Ovid's doctrine is not so easy to discover. The matter is still in dispute, but of the various possibilities that have been suggested, the most reasonable seem to be that of the troubadours were influenced by the culture of the Muslim Spain, where many of these elements can be found before and appear among the Christians. After the fall of Caliphate of Cordoba in 1031, the territory of the Moors was divided among 20 petty kings whom the Spanish historians in derision have called kings of parts. Until the coming of the Almoravids from the Africa in 1086, there was no religious fanaticism. The Muslims and Christians lived side by side on the practically an equal footing. The period was one of the pleasant and luxury of wine and love, but it was also a period of culture because among the Arabs and encouragement of literature was one of the traditional manifestations of royal power. Each of these petty kings had his court poets. The smaller town and the villages also produced their own poets who came from all walks of life. Although these poets were trained in the classical Arabic tradition, some even went to Arabia to perfect themselves in art. But the life they depicted in their poem was Spanish. For the traditional camp in the desert, they substituted the the garden of the Andalusia, and they described the care and interest of the beauties of their own country. Their poetry has the classical Arabic emphasis upon form, but it is at the same time both national and popular. Communications between these Muslim states with the Mozarabic subject and the adjoining Christian states was both easy and frequent. Often the poets themselves were the medium of the communication because they had been trained in the art of saying all things. They were often employed on mission both of the Mohammedans and the Christians. Sovereigns, secretaries, and ambassadors were often chosen from among their ranks, but such employment was precarious, and many of them changed masters either through necessity or in the hope of bettering their conditions. A set of wandering poets came into existence who passed from one court to another or sometimes found shelter with some bourgeois lover of verse. The situation is very much like that which developed a century later in France. Not only does Muslim Spain show us a type of civilization which may well have given the impetus to that of the province of Limousin, but even in the material form and the theme of the Spanish poets are like those that were later used by the troubadours. The material similarity do not concern us here, except that the fill in the picture, but the similarities in content do. Of we find almost all Not only does Muslim Spain house show us a type of civilization which may well have given the impetus of that in Provence and Limousin, but even the material form and the theme of the Spanish poets are like those that were later used by the troubadours. The material similarities do not concern us here, except they fill in the picture. But the similarities in the content, for here we find almost all the elements which combines the ideas of it. Give us courtly love. We find among the Arabs who two different attitudes towards the subject of love. They have a sensual tradition, perhaps native although colored by the work of Ovid, and another more spiritual tradition which appeared to be based upon the work of Plato as it has come down through the commentaries of Arabic scholars. As a presentation of the second point of view, we may consider the book called The Dove's Neck Ring, which was written about the year 1022 by the Andalusian Andalusian Ibn Hazm. At the present, in the request of the friend who had asked him for discussion of the subject, Ibn Hazm admits that the way of the Bedouin and the ancient in the matter of love are different from of our. Even in his own day, there was a great deal of dispute and much lengthy discussion about the nature. He is familiar with the Ovidian conventions that the lover must sign with weep and become pale and thin, and he cannot eat or sleep. He adds to these the sudden trembling in the presence of the loved one, but he thinks that the length to which the Arab have carried these conventions are absurd. He agrees with Ovid that the very secret of the love affair helped to make it pleasant, and is in practical agreement with him as to the effect of jealousy. Although he speaks of it under a heading avoiding broad about coquetry. In the later book, Kitab al-Alaq, he says definitely when jealousy fades out, you can be sure that love has faded out. But here he thinks of jealousy as the result of love rather than its cause. Ibn, Ibn Hazm concept of love, however, in its main aspect, very different from Ovid's and more resemble that of the Plato. He defines love as a reunion of part of soul which were separated in the creation. Its usual cause in an outwardly beautiful form, because the soul is beautiful and passionately desired anything beautiful and inclines towards the perfect image. This kind of love cannot be felt for more than one person, although the other type, which is really passion and improperly called love. The true love does not ignore the physical aspect, but the union of the soul is thousand times finer in its effect than that of the bodies. True love is not forbidden by jealous law, and it makes the lover better in many ways. For he tries with all his power to do what he was incapable of doing before, in order to show his good qualities and to make himself desirable. And how many estranged with one become generous and gloomy. One become bright-faced and coward become brave, and grouchy dispositions one become gay, and in ignoramus become clever, and solemnly one is his personal appearance dolled up and ill-shaped and become handsome. Ibn Hazm does not say specifically, and Andreas does, the love enables a character, but this seems clearly implied by his definition of love and by such remark. Among the praiseworthy natural gift and noble character and excellent characteristic in love and elsewhere in faithfulness. Certainly, system, true love, and nobility of the character go hand in hand. This type of love may be felt for a woman who is powerful and of the high rank, may felt for a slave girl, and the position of the slave girl in Muslim society was one which seems very strange to us today. In its purely spiritual aspect, such a love may be existed between two men without blame, but the question it complicates for us by the fact that among the Arabs, public opinion requires that if the beloved was a woman, she must, for decency's sake, be spoken as of man and referred by the Muslims pronouns of adjective and verb. Ibn Hazm disapproves of the practice which some poets indulged in the addressing their love poem to the daughters of their lords. Upon one point he must emphatic, one must not make love to a married woman. Muslims have come together on this point unanimously, only heuristic not fulfilling it. Or if circumstances prevent the union of the lovers, the man seeks for contentment in what he has and hope for more favors. When he does receive anything, he is filled with joy, but he does not pretend, as the troubadours sometimes did, and he finds joy in the mere fact and devotion in its rewards. There are different between Ibn Hazm's concept of love and that of the troubadours, but there is no justification for the statements of G. Genroy. There is no phrase, for example, Ibn Hazm, of ennobling power of love, nor of amorous and nor of the superiority of the lady over her love. That is to say, the courtly theories, there is much more than the trace of each of these. In his view of love, Ibn Hazm is by no means unique among Arabs. We find similar ideas in the work of the philosophers who preceded him, and we find them over and over again in the works of the poets of the 11th century. There were definite schools among them which advocate what Paris call Platonic love, but which resembles more closely what Andreas designate pure love. These poets taught that the man shows his good character and his good breedings by practicing a chaste love rather than a sensual love. But true love, whether pure or mixed, has an ennobling influence upon the love, making a man of the humblest birth or equal to a lady whom address. For among the Arabs, courtly manner were not exclusive prerogative of the upper class, but the lover, whether the higher or the lower rank of his beloved, speak of himself as form of slave, does not does honor to him. He addresses the lady by my lord, my master, and loves even when she tortures him. He finds sentiments when she rejects him. Delighted delights are made for its burning torment, a form of expression which is almost identical with that some of later Christian poets. In spite of what Ibn Hazm say about the fact that Muslim avoid love affair with married women, we find some of the poets did address their amateur rivers to the wives of other men. Pierce believes that this was not due to pure fancy, but that the verses reflect actual social conditions of the time. There are abundant evidence of the freedom which women, even married women, enjoyed in Andalusia of this period. We even know that Walad daughters of Khalifa Mustakfi established after father's death a sort of salon which was gathering place for literary men and other people of prominence. She was characterized as true, but the fact that such a state of things was tolerated at all shows a great deal with the freedom of Mohammedan women. Even if we accept the theory that courtly love is a fashion, a fusion of Latin and Moorish element, and not all scholars are willing to admit this, still we have not solved the problem of how and why it developed. In France, the first tro, troubadour of whom we have any record was Dusk William of Aquitaine, who had some acquaintance with Muslim Spain. His early poetry is by no means courtly, but traces of courtliness begin to appear in his later poems. Appeal says indeed that they contain all the elements of courtly love. There are some indications that the actual fusion of the various elements took place at the court of his friends and vassal, Viscount Ables II of Ventadon, Ibbles himself with a poet, although none of his verse has come down to us and was surrounded by poets, the most famous of whom were Bernard de Ventadon and Rogier. Both Bernard and Marcabru seem to be referring to a new courtly love of poetry when we speak of the poet school of Bells, but the style was soon adopted by poets in other parts of the country. The ideas were introduced into the north when Duke William granddaughter Eleanor of Aquitaine married Prince Louis of France, and later after a divorce from him, Prince Henry of England, in each case becoming queen with a short time. Bernard de Vendaton following her and doubtless helped her to introduce her idea in love into the north. In Paris, this was done apparently against considerable opposition in the part of King Louis and some of his advisors, but in London, with a second husband who was more in sympathy with her ideals, her influence was considerable. Thomas of Britain wrote his treatise Tristram and Sold under her inspiration, perhaps definitely of her, were dedicated to her brood. and it is generally believed that is a noble lady to whom Benoit de Saint Maur indicated his Romance of Troy. It seems probable that Mary de France was connected with the English court, perhaps also uh, Chrétien de Troyes. Three of Queen Eleanor's sons, Henry, Geoffrey, Richard, were patrons of literature, and at Poitiers kept upon the family tradition. Richard and wrote poetry of his own. But even more influential role was played by the two daughters, Eleanor and King Louis. They were both married in the same year. Mary de Count Henry and liberal Champagne, Alex to his brother Count Thibaut of Blois, both carried their mother and social literary interest. Countess Mary was particularly active in this respect, and Troyes, her husband, capital was even before the marriage sometime of a literary uh, center. Its most famous literary figure was Charitian, about whom we know so little that we are forced to call him, as he once called himself, Eric. Uh, Tritian de Troyes, his Eric and Enid was almost certainly written before Mary came to Troyes, and perhaps also a story of King Mark the Iseult the Bold, Blonde. These translations from Ovid, which he mentioned in the introduction of the Cligs, but which have come down to us. It is possible that the Ovidian translations were written after Countess Mary came to Troyes. Clinges almost certainly was far scholars have detected in the reference to the Heraclius of Guitier of Arras, and that we know from the reference to the Count Mary was written after a marriage. There is nothing in the above casuistry of Cliggs that Tatian could not even develop for him out of Ovid, but it seems most natural to attribute the difference in tone between this poem and the Eric and Enid to the giving growing influence in the of the Countess. As to this next poem, The Knight of the Cart, sometimes called Lancelot, there is no doubt whatever. He tells us plainly that the Countess furnished him with both subject matter and manner of treatment, sense that he is simply trying to carry out a desire and intention. His statement is perhaps praised as a compliment, but it is not difficult to see beneath the surface a note of apology of writing on the theme, which is not wholly in sympathy. The poem is an elaborate illustration of the doctrine of courtly love as it was introduced into northern France by Eleanor and Mary. Here, for the first time in Chrétien extant work, we find the glorification of the love of one man of another man's wife, a situation which friends had declared to be intolerable. Chrétien clearly found the poets in his next poem, the you UN, he rejected the ideas of the adulterous love, which he did not like, but retained the other conversation of courtly love, which apparently he did. In his last work, The Story of the Grail, departed even further from the idea of the ideas. The story he tells us and God book, which Count Philips of Flanders has given him. And this fact is generally assumed that Chrétien and how left Troyes was living at Philip's court. But this does not necessarily follow. We know that Phillips made a number of visits to Troyes at about his time, and may even been one of the those occasions of Charitian obtained from him the book of Speak. Charitian died before the finish and continuations. Charitian literary career shows us nature and in the some measured extent, the influence which Countess Mary exerts upon Circle of Troy. At least once during this period, she seems to have left her capital, to seek renewed inspiration from her mother at Poitiers. In 1167, King Henry had appointed his son Richard, then a boy of 11, Duke of Aquitaine, and Richard's mother accompanied him when he went to reign over this territory. He can hardly have even been more than a figurehead at first, while his mother was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. So it was she who was actual ruler, and she sought to review the former glories of her ancestors. The ducal place of Poitiers was rebuilt to provide some of the luxuries with which she had become acquainted when she visited Byzantine as Queen of France. To her court came the lord and ladies of her dominions, and she was able the first time to establish in a wholly congenial atmosphere a code of love on a grand scale. In so doing, if we just from the book of the Andrea, she was assisted by a daughter Mary, also an ardent devotee of art of love, by the niece Isabel of Flanders, whose devotion to its perception was soon involved in her trouble with her husband, and perhaps of Mary's sister in law, Adele of Champagne, who was now Queen of France, and we know from the poem of Canon de Bethune was found of presiding over assemblies where arms were recited. But the experiment was soon to become an end, for in the summer of 1174, King Henry came to Poitiers, took Queen Eleanor back to England, where she was impositions for the first time sent the other ladies to their home. In the year 1181, Count Henry Champagne died, leaving Countess Mary to act as regent during the minority of their son. She was now able, free from all interference, to receive in a small way her mother's social experiment. Troyes was not as congenial soil for the country love as Poitiers, with its memories of the Count William that troubadours had been, yet her influence was great, and in some measures it persisted down the time of her grandson, Thibaut the Great, who became king of Navarre and is best known for his love lyrics on the courtly mode and for his romantic affection of the Queen Blanche of Castile. The period of Mary agency was a period of literary activity. Canon de Bethune sang at her count, and poet Grace Brule was one of her vessels. You bo in the anonymous large paraphrase of the psalm belonged to this period, and thus average translation. Troy's working was a story of the Grail. It is almost certainly the period that the treatise of the art of the courtly love was written by Capellanus